Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft. I'm Natalie Swachina, the Education and Residency Director, and we're super excited that you can be here with us this afternoon for our final talk in our 2021 to 2022 Resident Artist Cycle. As you might know, our resident artists spend time at the Craft Center anywhere from 3, 6 months, 9 months to a year and have their studios open to the Houston public. They, in exchange, have the time and space to work on their practice, to work on their craft, and to share that with the public. We're very excited to hear from our 2 final residents this summer who have all been here for 3 months. Please drop any questions you might have into the chat, and we'll get started. So first up is Kelly Dzioba. Kelly is a Connecticut-based artist who explores textiles as a form of process art. She received her BFA in Craft and Material Studies from the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. She is a recipient of the Peters Valley School of Craft Arts Artist Fellowship, the Lenore Tawney Scholarship, and the William F. Delaney Fellowship. Her work has been exhibited in the United States and abroad at the Textile Center in Minneapolis, the Chanakotquay Institute in New York, the High Tide Project Space in Philadelphia, and the Jingyang Embroidery Museum in Seoul, South Korea. So as I said, Kelly's been here for 3 months, and you have just until the end of the month to catch her work. So I'm going to hand it over to Kelly now.
Hello, I'm Kelly. Thank you so much for Natalie for the introduction, and thank you so much for everyone at Houston Center for Contemporary Craft for giving me the platform to talk to you all about my work today. So I guess I can just start by saying that in my current body of work, I am creating 3-dimensional weavings with Mardi Gras beads. So I have a piece here that you can see. They're very like flexible structures. And the thing to know about it, just before I get into explaining the work a little bit more, is that like the work is completely made just by the tension of the beads, popping them together. I'm just going to give a little demo here. This is something that a lot of people have a connection to in terms of like playing with Mardi Gras beads when they were kids. I find usually about 50% of people who come through my studio either know exactly what I mean or have no idea what I'm talking about, but are delighted to find out that this is like what you can do. So this is like the primary form of connection that forms all of the work in the series that you'll see today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm just going to go a little bit into my background here to sort of give a sense of like where this work came from in the course of like my, artistic progression. So as Natalie mentioned, I studied in the Craft and Material Studies program at University of the Arts. The fiber textile program at UArts is definitely a program that encourages a more like conceptual or metaphorical framework for understanding and exploring textiles. So this is an example of one of my thesis pieces where I was interested in the relationship of like the way that fabrics age in relationship to the way that we use them and the way that they interact with like the body. And so for this piece, it was a piece of canvas that I laid over a relief surface of a pattern that I placed in a doorway to our main administrative building. So as people walked over it and basically created like a rubbing on the surface, this pattern of the textile emerged as the textile was being used. So it was like reversing the age process that like as this textile was being used, it was actually coming into itself instead of being faded away. I also, when I was at UArts, I kind of got into I was really kind of in love with like minimalism and post-minimalism and conceptual art and, made some like weird, funny things, sort of like descaled like sculpture. But I really enjoyed this idea of like taking a material and like through accumulation, seeing like what was like the sort of like given or inherent property of the material, like seeing what it could do. And so for this piece here, it's like a series of like kids' socks that are just worn on top of themselves, to the point where like the fabric can't stretch anymore. And so you can sort of see that this material like extrapolated out under like all this pressure basically just becomes this like cartoon like foot, like this sort of yeah, this chopped off foot. So after school, I went to go work in a textile mill in Northeast Philadelphia in a neighborhood called Frankfurt. The mill that I worked for manufactured vintage auto upholstery fabric recreations, as well as industrial felts. And so we wove a lot of these like really heavy duty, intense and like super thick fabrics. And I was the person who like sat in front of the loom and watched the machines, make sure nothing bad happened. And I just kind of got lost in watching like the mechanics of the loom. And it was the first time that it like really became real to me, the level of like engineering and like architecture that lives inside a fabric. You know, you think of it as just like a 3D or like a two-dimensional space, a sort of planar material, but there's so much structure and there's so much dimensionality that like lives within the material. So just to give you an idea of when I talk about like the woven felts, so I always like as a student, especially I loved like multi-cloth weaving structures. And woven felt is produced in a way that you have a woven structure that can grow in 3 dimensions essentially on the loom. So it can be up to like an inch thick. So the diagram on the top you can see is like one sort of single plane, like plain weave structure. And then like below that, you see this like really delicious lasagna of fabric, which is essentially like multiple planes of like warp and weft that are interwoven with one another. So you're taking that warp and that weft that's moving, you know, like in 2 different dimensions, and then you add up layers that move into that 3rd dimension. So, you know, after school, in terms of like what was accessible to me, I started weaving. I got really interested in translating this like woven felt structure into my weaving work, using that as like sort of like a drawing material, and embedding like pieces of like linen into the structure, supplementary warp and weft, to create these drawings that could become sort of like 3-dimensional or like faded into the fabric. So playing with that tension between like a 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional space, and sort of like bringing attention to that like sort of architectural aspect of the fabric. But as I like, you know, was weaving on the loom, I realized that for a lot of weavers, the romance is in the weaving process. But for me, you know, I always kind of felt like, you know, looms are a very rigid structure that is not necessarily like the most friendly to the human body. And also I think that where I found the romance in weaving was in the planning of weaving, in the structure of weaving, and in the communication of the structure of weaving. So I always sort of loved, you know, textile punch cards as an object, because I felt that as though they're like objects that are just as beautiful as the things they produce. And they are also evocative of the like sort of visual language of the things that they produce, that they almost look like lace to a certain extent. So I was like playing around with like translating language into this like punch card structure, and you know, making my own punch cards in vellum. So one winter, you know, in I think it was like 2016, I was working on this big commission piece, this giant weaving. You know, I had a tight deadline. I was super miserable because it was like just the middle of January. And I was working so hard, and all the linen dust coming off of my loom gave me like a respiratory infection, and I just wasn't happy. I also was just like going through a really like rough period in my life in general. And so, you know, at one point in facing this deadline, I was like walking through a craft store and just sort of letting myself like completely stim out on like looking at all the like super bright materials. And so I found these packs of Mardi Gras beads. And, you know, in terms of like avoiding the thing that I had to do, I suddenly like made this connection of like, oh, that's what I want to do. I suddenly remembered this like this memory of like being a kid and like popping the beads together. And I thought to myself, like, oh, I can make weaving that way. And so I just bought these beads. And again, in spite of my deadline, I made this. And it just felt like it was something that was like fun. I enjoyed the process. It was had some levity to it. And so, yeah, it just really did something to me. It did something for me. I think also at this point in my life, you know, like I mentioned, I was going through like sort of a rough period. And I also sort of recognized, you know, this was when I was still living in Philadelphia. I had been living in South Philly for a number of years. And I think in my artwork, you know, I've always sort of like absorbed and like translated the sort of material culture of my environment into my work. And so, you know, in South Philly, it's all row homes. And it was kind of this like sort of tradition of like a lot of people got really into decorating like their front windows, you know, for like different holidays or different events. Like here's like Pope Francis visit edition. Here's Valentine's Day. And, you know, I'd never really been a big fan of Christmas, but suddenly I got really into like Christmas lights and like Christmas decorations and like bright reflective tinsel and like the sort of like chintzier the better. And I like would decorate my window and then I would keep these decorations in my window until like March. And I realized that like a lot of like the way that we sort of like decorate for holidays and a lot of these like bright, super, you know, like flashy materials are sort of like this capitalist answer to like seasonal affective disorder. And it was just like, oh, that's why I need these Christmas lights. It's because I'm like going through this like really depressive time and I need this brightness in my life. And I think that sort of similar to the way that I suddenly got really into like this sort of kitsch, you know, culture of like Christmas and like holiday decorations, it was the same sort of impulse that like made me fall in love with like working with Mardi Gras beads. So I kept playing with the material and sort of figuring out like different ways that I could connect it. So here you see like it changed the spacing of the beads, it created a more stable like planar structure. You know, here's like more of like a lacy structure. And then eventually I suddenly made this connection one day. I went back to the delicious lasagna weaving structure and I realized that I could do that thing with the beads. And then suddenly it like cracked open something in the work that it got to be something a little bit more. So then I started making work essentially that looks like this. So I realized that I could build the beads out into 3 dimensions. And, you know, I started like making work that I think that there's always been a lot of like textile reference in my work. And it's really by way of like, you know, when you are sort of following the principles of like a gridded structure, you then like come back to the same answers of like these textile motifs because it's sort of like of this, it follows the rules of the system that it's based on. But it's also like, you know, I loved the idea that by this sort of like binary method of building work, you know, like with weaving, you know, you have a single thread that can go up or it can go down. And that's the same way that this like sort of beaded woven structure worked. But within that framework, you can find all of these like extravagant answers to the same question. So here you see like, you know, I realized I could translate like a tumbling block pattern into 3 dimensions. Also finding references to things like fashion. So like, you know, studded collars and like gem cuts and athletic stripes. Which I will say that like, you know, this sort of like late 70s, early 80s, like athletic stripes and, you know, athletic wear has always kind of been this like love of mine aesthetically. And I think it's because, you know, like sometimes when you're young, and you fall in love with a person or a thing and you don't necessarily know how to put language to that thing, you suddenly like realize that you just want to make that entire thing your whole personality. And so for me, I don't know, man, I think I can trace it to Natasha Lyonne in Slums of Beverly Hills, but it's always like a motif that kind of shows up in my work often. So, you know, in making work like this, which has references to sort of like maybe like op art, geometric abstraction, but then also, again, returning to the sort of environment of my times, looking at like beveled mirrors. So just to give you a sense, like, you know, South Philly has like a very distinctive style of homes and like different like architectural features that you will find in these homes. And I'm sure it's not just Philly, but it's definitely like there's a lot of like really great time capsules in like these neighborhoods. So you can kind of get a sense for it here, but you know, just by like voyeuristically like peeking into people's windows or even just like apartment hunting and seeing like 10,000 different like styles of South Philly house and South Philly apartment, you know, like I always loved these like apartments that have the entire like walls of like the beveled mirrors. And again, it's something that, you know, I've always like loved and kind of shows up in the work in that way. Yeah, so there's also ways in which, you know, I've kind of built the work that are reflective of like concepts that come from like textile structure. So for instance, you know, this is like an example of damask weave. So you can see in the tablecloth and in the napkin, it's the style of weave where essentially you have a satin weave on top of like a more like flat weaving structure. And all of the threads are the same color, but because there's variation in the direction of the threads and how much of the warp versus weft is visible, it creates this sort of like optical effect where, you know, it might sort of become like much less visible from certain angles, and then it might really stand out at a different angle where like the different directional threads are catching light in a different way. And so I realized that that's something that I could do with the beads as well, because that sort of like spacing of the beads gives me like this shallow relief that can do some pretty nice things. So this is an example here. It's like pretty subtle, but so you see like this piece, this flat piece straight on, you can sort of see the implication of like the diagonal stripes, but it just sort of blends into like one color. Whereas on the right-hand side, you can sort of see that those blue and gold stripes kind of pop out of it. Which is also, again, sort of like coming back to my love of like minimalism. I love this idea of like, you know, it's like by translating all of these like textile ideas into this other material, it creates this sort of material presence in a different way. And I enjoy that these are structures that are going to change and going to give you different views and different effects as you move around them in space. So it's definitely work that I enjoy when people get to encounter in person. So another like effect or like textile structure idea that I've definitely taken inspiration from in this work is shadow weave, which is essentially a weaving structure where you have, you know, two different layers of information happening. So you have like, you know, your warp and weft colors are alternating on each thread. And then you also have like, let's say like a twill pattern or something that's built on top of that. And so those two different like rules are interacting with each other. That creates like a third sort of effect in the woven fabric. I know that's kind of like, that's might be a little bit esoteric there, but this is a piece that I actually made in residence here at HCCC, which basically I took that like tumbling block, like 3D block structure, and I passed all these like these strands of Mardi Gras through it, so that the strands are moving through each block on the diagonal. And so essentially when you like combine those two sort of like rules of like you have these like diagonal stripes and then you have the 3D block pattern, the way that those two pieces of information or those two like patterns interact with each other, then in real space create this like this third sort of pattern, which is the sort of like the crosses that sort of tessellate with one another. So the question that I get most as a resident here is why Mardi Gras beads, especially being in Texas, which is so close to New Orleans and Galveston, which have like huge traditions of Mardi Gras. Someone from the north, like from the Northeast, where Mardi Gras isn't really as much of a tradition, people are always curious, like, how did you stumble into this? And I think there's a number of things that go into this. And I realize more and more over time that a lot of it is maybe like somewhat based on personal narrative. A lot of it is just sort of like functional to the work. And I will say that, it is a material that is pretty pervasive, like everywhere you go. Like I remember these from like birthday parties, carnivals, et cetera, et cetera. So on a functional level, I will say that, it's a material that just allows me to build in a certain way. I appreciate that the form of connection is inherent to the material itself. And it sort of, captivates my, my material exploration heart in that way, in the sense that, I like seeing what a material can do instead of pushing my own expectations onto a material, I think, per se. Yeah. And on a personal level, I think that what I've realized over time is that, so for instance, this past year I was diagnosed with ADHD, and so it was something that I learned about myself that really opened up a lot of things for me, of like understanding why I am the way that I am, and all of these different encounters I've had throughout my life, and like the ways that I've like interfaced with the world, and I realized that a lot of this work is really just based in stimming, which, if you're not familiar with that term, it's basically a shorthand for like seeking stimulation in different actions. So I'm just someone who's like always touching things with my hands, always just needing to be touching something or like playing with something, from the time that I was a kid, but definitely still as an adult. And then also like the visual stimulation of like seeing bright and shiny materials, and like the way that these sort of become holographic at a certain point. So that's really important. That's it very much in the work for me, as well as the fact that I think that kind of coming up in the world, growing up as a fat person in the world, I've always sort of had a difficult relationship to my aesthetic choices, in the sense of like, the aesthetic choices that were made available to me, and the sort of expectations that were placed on me as a fat person. I think that, when I was growing up, there was two answers. It's like, you can either just wear all black and wear like super dour clothing and like try to conceal yourself, or that you had to distract away from like these like undesirable, quote unquote, I don't really feel this way, but like you had to wear like very bright, flashy and super, super femme clothing in order to distract from your own fatness, essentially. Sort of like, razzle dazzle camouflage. And I hated both of those answers, but as like an act of self-preservation, I just sort of, was very muted in all of the choices that I made for myself aesthetically, and that kind of bled into my work. And so I think that, as I like have become like more comfortable with myself as an adult, I've kind of like opened myself up to being more into like bright and vibrant colors, just vibrancy in general, and patterns and all of these things. And that, it's found its way into my work, and then also, in a certain way, a lot of the things that I make are still pretty reserved. I make sort of discrete objects that are very, symmetrical, very organized. I do like the idea of moving towards a place where I can take more risks in my work and like let it be more organic. But I think that that's sort of a process in my work that will parallel that process that I like, that self-work for myself as a person. And so then pulling back out on like a greater level, some things that I think about a lot in my work, which the use of Mardi Gras beads and the way the sort of types of visual language that I find through the work allow me to sort of examine and like process, is like, I think a lot about, the hierarchy of value that we place on different types of aesthetics. So a lot of my work calls out to, again, like minimalism, geometric abstraction, but also to a lot of like kitsch handicraft, textile tradition. And I place all of these things in my work in equal regard and equal esteem because they're all so important to me. So this is a piece that's sort of capturing like this Bargello pattern. Something that I like think a lot about now is the way that when we think of like retro or like vintage pastiche of like this like sort of 60s psychedelic aesthetics, because this was a time when people were coming to really appreciate like folk art in many ways. And really, this was like sort of part of like the birth of like the craft movement was around this time. So many of these like references that we think of as like dated to this period in time, this like sort of mid-century era, are actually based in different types of folk art. So on the left, you see Bargello, which is actually Hungarian like needlepoint. It's called flamework. And then on the right-hand side is like Bulgarian pottery, this is actually something that I kind of stumbled across this year. I had no idea that this sort of like, again, psychedelic aesthetic was a type of folk art. But I think a lot about the cycles by which like, as aesthetics become more in fashion and more coveted, versus seen as being like dated or something of the past or like past its relevancy. And, the ways that the sort of level of like value may reflect how we feel about the people for whom this aesthetic serves and the places that these things come from. And I find great irony in the fact is like, as things come in and out of fashion, that these things will then become more or less like less accessible to the people for whom like in a previous generation maybe have been looked down upon for these types of aesthetic. And so this also calls back to a lot of what I was like looking at before in terms of like beveled mirrors and like different things like that, as we sort of see like the gentrification of like a lot of different types of aesthetics in the world. So I also am thinking of like an example here is like Memphis, the Memphis aesthetic. You can see on the example on the left is Ettore Setsas, who's like one of the like original famed like Memphis designers, versus like a 90s like Taco Bell, which is in the same visual language, but obviously, as a culture we feel two completely different ways. Is that like as an aesthetic becomes accessible to the masses, it then becomes less, valued essentially. So I also think a lot about this like sort of hierarchy of like aesthetic value in terms of like, the places that I come from, like my upbringing. So I made a joke recently that like, I want my next body of work to look like a New Jersey boardwalk ride. And I kind of manifested that in my work. And I think that, I kind of call back to this sort of like this whole world because, when I was growing up, my family went to the Jersey Shore every year and we went to the boardwalk, and it was made clear to me that like, the places that we went were like less desirable. It was like we went to the bad part of the shore because it was like garish. It was a little bit tacky, a little bit trashy. And it made me really sad to kind of feel like, these parts of myself were like embarrassing or something that I couldn't really own. And now I come back to it and I can love and appreciate these things because I can see that these sort of like judgment calls were maybe based on a sort of classist assumption about a lot of people. But I see a lot of this sort of like over the topness and this maximalism in the place that I am now, Texas, which I can really, come to love and appreciate. I think it's part of like what I really love about being here. It's just sort of absorbing the visual like culture of this place. I also think a lot about this artist that I really appreciate, Megan Price. She coined a hashtag on Instagram called Textile Simulacrum, which is basically like, you know, these sort of like impersonations of a traditional like textile object. I think of like Mardi Gras beads as like a form of like jewelry simulacrum. And so, you know, I think working with this type of material also allows me to examine, you know, disposability and, you know, yeah, I guess disposability and consumerism in my work. But on my way to Texas, I stopped at a place called Arc GNO, which does like bead recycling. As I think more about like the effects of the material that I work with on my health, I come to realize, you know, how dirty and like how pervasive this material is in the environment. They're made of like low-grade plastics. So as a way of like trying to protect myself health-wise, but also thinking more about the greater picture of like the ecological component of like, this is a material. You know, part of my residency here is that I wanted to try and find ways to maybe move towards working with secondhand like sourced materials. So in particular, this is an organization that takes Mardi Gras beads out of, you know, the gutters and the streets after parades, recycles them. And I think that working with the secondhand materials allows me to bring a new element into the work, which is like these traces of the ways that these, you know, these materials have been used in the world. So, you know, you can see sort of like staining, you can see this aging in the material. And it calls back to like, you know, my thesis work back from UArts of like sort of seeing the history of a material as being part of the thing itself. And also allows me to expand out like this palette in terms of like, you know, you see all these different colorations from like the way that the material has aged over time. And so it's an exciting new direction that I've exploring here. And I'm excited to keep going down this path after I leave Houston. So thank you so much for joining me. Yeah, that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelly. It was great to get to know more about your process. And I really enjoyed learning about how your environment really influences what you're doing. And I know you told me that you were excited to see how Texas will expose or influence your environment after this. I know you talked a little bit about the over-the-topness of Texas, and I know you've also been going out into Houston and around the area to really explore Texas. Is there anything that you've seen here that you think will really influence you? You talked about the bubble mirrors and, you know, on the East Coast, anything that's jumping out to you from this particular environment that you can see as an influence?
That's a really good question. I think that that's something that, you know, it's sort of like comes to me over time. It's just like, it's not necessarily the thing I fall in love with now, but it's the thing that I like keep thinking about 6 months from now. I mean, you know, at the moment, I just sort of love like, I come from the Northeast where all of our cities are like gridded in a way, which obviously like also up to my work, but it's just a place that's much more organic. And there's just so many more like layers of everything here. It's really beautiful. Yeah, I don't know. I think over time it'll sort of start to show up in certain ways. But you know, I always think about this balance between minimalism and maximalism in my work, and I think it is just great to be in a totally like maximalist environment here.
That's a great way to describe the no zoning of Houston. So
Yeah.
I do have a question for you from Facebook from Kathleen. She's wondering what you think of the work of El Anatsu, and, you know, how does the scale of your pieces inform their effect as well?
Yeah, I've always wanted to like kind of work on a larger scale. You know, I like have made like just sort of discrete objects that do grow in scale, but I am interested in like moving in that direction. So it's been so amazing to be able to see the incredible installation that's in the Museum of Fine Art Houston by Ellen Atsui, because it's an all-encompassing experience. It's breathtaking, and it's taking this material and it's just transforming it in a way that it's just so organic and it's so incredibly beautiful. And I think that sometimes, you know, having an encounter with something that's just like so much larger than yourself really creates this like powerful experience between yourself and the piece. And so, you know, I think it's definitely something that I'm also interested in exploring, like different scales of work, and maybe at some point, like maybe more environmental work, like as in creating environments. But yes, I'm a huge fan.
I can't wait to go into an environment of your work. That would be just such an amazing, awe-inspiring experience. So make sure you let me know when you do that. You know, I have one question too. You've shown a lot of source images and, you know, patterns and references that really inform your work. And then you showed a lot of finished pieces. But how are you planning these out? You know, there's so much geometry with this. What is your process like taking those reference, almost a lot of 2D flat images and then creating these 3D patterns with it?
A combination of methods. Sometimes I make paper models, like I'll make three-dimensional paper models. Most of the time I just map things out on grid paper. And sometimes I do renderings in Illustrator to just sort of see like, you know, a little preview of like what this will look like as a dimensional piece. And then sometimes I play with the material on a smaller scale. So I'll like swatch it out, or I'll like think of a different, a type of approach I want to take with the work, and just make a little sample of it.
It's awesome. So what are your plans now? You're leaving in a couple weeks. What are your plans when you return home?
So I'm just heading home to Connecticut. I'm gonna keep focusing on my studio practice, but I'm kind of a free agent at this point. In the immortal words of Bruce Springsteen, this gun's for hire. I've always like, I think through my 20s, I kind of stopped myself from taking risks in opportunities that I would pursue because I always felt like I needed to be tied to like a full-time job. I mean, for very practical reasons as well. But I do love this sort of freedom that I have now to just like pursue whatever comes next. So yeah, we'll see.
Well, we've loved having you at the Craft Center this summer. Kelly's been in our fishbowl, so she's had lots of, you know, campers and audience members, visitors stopping by her studio. So we thank you for being here with us. And I know I can't wait to see these installations of large scale with the beads. I'm ready, Kelly. Make sure you send me an email when you're done.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, if you have any more questions for Kelly, please feel free to jump them and drop them in the chat, and we can always swing back around. But I'm going to move on to our next resident for now. So thank you so much, Kelly. Okay. So next up, we have Stephanie J. Woods. Stephanie is our Craft plus Photography resident that's in conjunction with the Houston Center for Photography. And this is our second round of our joint residency. These residents are really working at the intersection of craft and photography, and we're very excited to have Stephanie here with us this summer. Stephanie is a multimedia artist from Charlotte, North Carolina, currently based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where she's an assistant professor of interdisciplinary art at the University of New Mexico. Her work fuses a relationship between photography and fiber. She earned her MFA in New Media Sculpture and is a recipient of several residencies and fellowships, including Black Rock Senegal, the Fine Arts Work Center Fellowship, the ARC Residency, the McColl Center for Art and Innovation, Oxbow School of Art and Artist Residency, and the Penland School of Craft. Her work is featured in the permanent collection at the Virginia Museum of Fine Art in Richmond, Virginia. She's also exhibited her work at Smack Melon and Tiger Strikes Asteroid, both located in Brooklyn. Her work has been featured in Bomb Magazine, Arts Papers, Burn Away, and the Boston Art Review. And today is actually Stephanie's last day at the Craft Center. So we're really excited that we could get a chance to peek into your practice and your studio before you head back to New Mexico. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie. And please remember, you can drop any questions for her in the chat and we'll have time at the end to answer them. Awesome.
Nice. Thank you, Natalie. So let me share my screen. It's a pleasure. Thank you all for joining. Okay. Okay, so the work I'm going to share with you all today, I'm really going to focus in on one particular body of work that I really feel like encapsulates who I am as an artist and conceptually like the concepts and ideas that I work with. So I'm going to focus on specifically like my use of material language. So this is a project here titled The Weight of It. Maybe the past 2 years, right, since COVID has started, I've just had like so much to fill. And as I'm sure like a lot of us have, I felt this need to slow down. I felt the need to be more present, and also felt the need to focus more on nuanced moments and minimal compositions grounded in like repetition and reinforcement. And so I'm going to play a video here that I feel really encapsulates like those feelings that I had.
Bleached. Bleached by blackness. Bleached by blessing. Bleached by hardship. Bleached by lesson. Bleached by joy. Bleached by truth. Bleached by magic. Bleached by youth. Bleached by spirit. Bleached by success. Bleached by confidence. Bleached by happiness. Bleached by booty. Bleached by curls. Bleached by expression. Bleached back the world. Bleached. Bleached by blackness. Bleached by blessing. Bleached by hardship. Bleached by lesson. Bleached by joy. Bleached by truth. Bleached by magic. Bleached by youth. Bleached by spirit. Bleached by success. Bleached by confidence. Bleached by happiness. Bleached by booty. Bleached by curls. Bleached by expression. Bleached back the world.
Okay.
Bleached.
Okay. So my body of work, it really examines performative behavior and the cognitive effects of forced assimilation. And so this includes the effects of intergenerational trauma, the politicization of Afro hair, and the everyday coping devices and affirmations that we establish to survive. So often in my work, I will utilize symbolic imagery and materials that reference Black American culture and my experiences growing up in the South. As Natalie mentioned, I am from Charlotte, North Carolina, but I was born in Seneca, South Carolina. And so all of that has had an impact on my work. So here is an image of, there we go. So this is an image of the installation of that specific piece. So the video that you just saw, the title of that is The Weight of It. And I've started calling it a moving audio photography piece. And I call it that because depending on how it's viewed, there's really no beginning or end. And also because of the subtlety of the action that's happening in the video, I essentially see it as a photograph that's been activated through sound and subtle movement. But I've had the pleasure of installing The Weight of It as a site-specific installation in November of 2020 at Oakwood Arts, which is located in Richmond, Virginia. And the building that that particular work was installed in is an old Sunday school building. And so the video was rear projected to the audience. And Oakwood Arts is a community-centered arts organization that focuses on making arts and careers in the arts like accessible to communities. And so it was just like a pleasure to install this work, to have it installed in the middle of a neighborhood, to try to figure out ways to make the work accessible to the community, especially with during 2020, right? We know what was going on at that time. And so I've been really interested in installing work in basically these untraditional spaces to try to give the work just a little bit more life inside and outside of gallery spaces. So to give you just a little bit more context about the work, I captured it while we were in lockdown due to the pandemic. And prior to that, my hair was locked for, let's see, I need to click on it. There we go. My hair was locked for 9 years. And so here's a picture of that. And during lockdown, I basically slowly unraveled every single lock in my head with a needle, and I did this for 3 months. And this is just because, similar to what like Kelly was speaking about, like having to always do something with your hands, also dealing with like a form of anxiety. I did this to kind of keep myself busy. But over time, right, there's accumulation of like all the hair on my head, like it became heavy. And so that's where the material description comes from. If you saw like in the text, it said like 9 years of detangled Afro hair. It's talking about that process of detangling the hair. And as I detangled it, I ended up with a bag full of hair that essentially became like a fibrous medium that I could begin to work with. So the decision to weave the hair into kind of like a vessel-like form, as well as like this idea to cover the body in Carolina red clay, came from like this play on the body as a vessel. And so like, if you look closely in the video, you'll notice that the skin was slightly a little off, and that's because it was covered in red dirt. And so like this idea of using specifically like red clay for me speaks about where I'm from. So I'm born in South Carolina, raised in North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina, and there's red. Our ground is red. Like when you're walking around, it's common to see red dirt, red clay throughout the southeastern part of the United States. And so the clay covering my body in this performance, it was hand harvested by my husband, Johannes Barfield, in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. But it also speaks about like me not being able to wear like white shoes, like just always this idea of this material being reminiscent of home and a connection to the land. So continuing on speaking about like land and home, I want to transition to a little bit to the sound that was included in the audio. So I've collaborated with artist Johannes Barfield, who created the sample-based score that goes with the piece. And so the audio for the piece, if you were to listen closely, you'll hear the sound of water. You also will hear the sound of fire. And during the time when the piece was being made, of course, on top of the pandemic that was going on, we also had like an uprising that was happening in Minneapolis and all over, right, America, in response to the killing of George Floyd. And so this idea of seeing images of fire, seeing the color of fire naturally like folded itself into the work and played a part into the audio. After the audio was created for the piece, began to reflect on like what that meant to me and my own personal interpretation of it. And there was a specific Martin Luther King Jr. quote that stood out to me, which is, "We have fought hard and long for integration, as I believe we should have. And I know that we will win, but I've come to believe we're integrating into a burning house." So in addition to Johannes, who created the sound, I also work pretty heavily with a poet, Laura Neal, who wrote the poem that accompanies the piece. And the poem was written specifically for this body of work. I've been working with Laura since around like 2018. I met Laura at the Fine Arts Work Center. And I want to read a reflection that Laura wrote about the poem from her perspective of like what the poem Bleach means to her. And so while I'm reading that, we'll just look at this video of the installation. But Laura writes, "I wrote this poem while living in a place where when I walked into the world, I was othered, either in aberration or in disdain. I even had someone tell me directly that I would look good in whiteface. I wrote this form in frustration of being othered, resisting the dichotomy of being Black. I think of the word bleach as both a noun and a verb. The process of saturation, the historical one-drop rule. The word bleach takes me to permanence, and the only way to alter is to alter further into invention and then into reinvention. Blackness on a permanent cycle, always trending, always bending. The prefix re is another form of cycle, meaning again. It indicates a kind of repetition. I consider the ways we are represented, resented, reduced, revived, rewarded, reborn, revered. In the poem, there's a metrical stress on each of the N words because we are in constant reckoning with struggle, from our joys to our curls. This poem lives in both pride and pain. I wrote this poem feeling targeted, feeling the minor and minority, but the most capitalized upon. The irony of being broad yet patterned with bias, society is wielding with audacity and authority, discrimination and othering. The final line in the poem, Bleach Back the World, is a call to agency, a call for Black folks to reclaim that authority, that naming, and redefine our own identity. So in alignment with what Laura spoke about, kind of like this feeling of feeling minor and minority, but the most capitalized upon, that was something that I began to think about, is like thinking of another iteration of the weight of it. So this is the weight of it too, and playing with the idea of like women as giants or deities to address invisibility and hypervisibility. I've been thinking a lot about public spaces and ways to create alternative exhibitions outside traditional gallery spaces. And I've mainly been thinking of this because of how insular and excluding the art world can be to marginalized groups of people. So this time the work was installed at Richmond, Virginia Community Hospital, which is now owned by Virginia Union University. And to give you a little bit of context about this location, Richmond Community Hospital was the first African-American patient care facility in Virginia. And Sarah Garland Jones was the first woman to pass the examination by the Virginia Board of Medicine and is credited with pioneering this hospital. So the work was installed in the building, and then this is a view from it, from the street, so you can see what people saw when they were walking by. And then here is a detailed image of the photo before it was altered to fit the architecture of the building. So in this version of the weight of it, there's an umbrella tree that's in the sculpted vessel, as opposed to the video piece, water is falling, as almost as if like the water caused this umbrella to grow and shield the vessel. And so some of the other work, and so that's the weight of it, and that's the project that I wanted to focus on. But I'll show you like a few images of things I've been working on in my studio, and where I'm at currently. I don't really have too many words for it because it's still new, but I'll just click through the pictures and describe like what's here. So this is a piece titled My Papa Used to Play Checkers. It includes a watermelon, and then like Afro hair that's been sculpted around like a figure. This is another piece where the sunshine shines, and those two images were captured here at the Craft Center. The sand that's in this was collected in Galveston, Texas. And then here's an image as well. And the series is called Shake 'em. So it's really about a feeling of childhood, having beads in my hair, the body playing with metaphors of like the body as an instrument as well. And the fabric that's in here was dyed by me, and then the hair was decorated, these adornments. But yeah, I'll stop it here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. It's wonderful to learn about your practice and to really, I think those videos are so powerful to actually feel like you're there. So often with video and photography and sound work that are site specific, it's hard for us to experience that. And so you were really able to bring us in there, and that's wonderful. I love your collaborative nature, from working with a poet to working with, composers, and I think that your work as well is such this intersection of craft and photography that, really you're working across mediums, across, artists. And I thought maybe could you talk about your work being at that intersection of craft and photography and how you feel about that?
Yeah, I kind of feel like I accidentally became a photographer because I've been working with textiles like all my life since I was a little kid. And it became where it was a point in my practice where I started, I'm really interested in functionality. And so wearable things as well. And so that's where the photography began to kind of take a role and play in it, where I would make these like wearable head pieces. And I'm like, okay, now what? And I felt like the only way was for it to engage with the body through a photograph. And so over the years, I've been doing it since like 2013 now. And so like over the years now, photography has naturally become a part of my practice in a way that I think, whereas in the past, it was more material-based, material studies. And now I kind of like think fluidly back and forth between the two. And so that's where the intersection comes into, because I'm so process-based. I always approach a photograph with like, I don't have the image in my head. I'm usually making something first, where I'm dyeing fabric or I am beading something. And then I'm like, okay, now what can I do with this? And then that's when the composition comes together, like in the photography.
Yeah, what is your process like? Are you planning out the photos before? Are you thinking about, you just mentioned you're thinking about the different objects that you have to make to create this, but what's your process like to make a series?
So usually it's me playing with materials. So like I'll find something and then I'll just start playing with materials. And I think that's something that's inherently like craft, like this idea of exploration, material process. And so I'll make something, I'll draw a sketch. I'll take that sketch, put it into the computer and do digital edits to it, take the photograph, maybe not like it, go back, readjust the sketch, and then take it again. So it's really a play off. I'm very process driven. So it rarely ever comes out the way that I think it's going to come out in like in the beginning. It's just a back and forth pool that's happening.
So what's next to you? You leave tonight. So what's next for you after you leave Houston?
Yeah, so I'm teaching at the University of New Mexico, but I have 2 exhibitions opening next summer. So I'm going to start working very intensely. I've already been working intensely, but I have to meet those deadlines. So I'm working on a few like weavings that are not photo-based that will grow into like an installation that's opening at the Harvey B. Gantt Center for African American Art plus Culture, and then another one at the Sarasota Art Museum.
Because, you also have this other body of work as well, or some previous bodies of work where you were using quilting and photography. And so that's interesting to hear the weavings as well. I'm interested to see, just like I'm ready for Kelly's big installations at some point. I'm excited to see these weavings as well, that are, a whole different way of how you're expressing yourself. So how has the time in Houston been for you? I mean, you've had 3 months here. We were talking about this earlier today, just about the time and space. But I wonder if you can talk about, as a professor and as an artist, what does it mean for you to have some time and space away from your teaching?
Yeah, it's been really, because I've been teaching full time it's only been a year, but that first year, I guess like transitioning, it was like this realization of not having, like similar to what Kelly was saying now, like being able to freely, move and go. I've like, oh, wow, I can't just, be here or there at any time that I want. And so I can't just be in my studio. And so having the time here to like really set aside that time to work, and also kind of just re-spark inspiration to take home with me has been really, really great. And so that's like the main benefit. I think the time and space, but also just I've noticed that the art community here are really interested in what artists are doing. They're eager to meet new artists. And so that has also been really nice to feel like appreciated for what I do.
Well, we've really enjoyed having you here, Stephanie. You're our second craft plus photography resident, and we, started this collaboration with the Houston Center for Photography to really hope to nurture those artists working in these fluid lines of what craft means, and we're trying to expand the definition of craft. And we had noticed so much that was happening within photography. And I remember during your interview, you had said something, about how you had always felt straddling these worlds and that this residency was, made for you because it is this intersection of the two. And so we're so happy that you were able to be with us here this summer and to produce such a, fascinating body of work here and to share your experiences. So thank you for being our second craft plus photography resident.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I really want to take a big shout out to both Kelly and Stephanie for sharing so much about their process and their materials with us. They both have been wonderful residents with us the last 3 months. This actually concludes our 2021 cycle, and we'll have a brand new cycle of artists starting in September. So please check back this fall for more about our residents. They'll have a show opening this entire cycle, and residents will open later this month at the Craft Center. So please come check them out, come view their work in person. And we really thank you for being with us today and for supporting our residency program. Have a nice afternoon, everyone.